Good evening. Several years ago, I saw an interview with a British celebrity who was also a noted atheist. And during the interview, he was asked about his atheism and whether he thought there was any possibility that God existed. He denied that God did exist, but then he said, if it turns out that I'm wrong, if I die and God does exist, I will start by saying to him, how dare you? I mean, children dying of cancer, wars, bloodshed, all the misery on planet Earth. How dare you? And I remember at the time thinking, if God exists in everything that you could imagine God to be, I don't think you're going to say that to him. I think you're going to be on your face in front of him, and if he's kind to you, he will give you some understanding of his divine plan. But the last thing that God, if he exists, would do is sit on his glorious throne and wait to hear from you complain to him about the life that he gave you. Now, I think that because I am familiar with the book of Job, and that's really why I fired up the webcam this evening. I want to review for just a moment what happened in the book of Job, because Job went through a tremendous amount of suffering. The human condition was very difficult for Job. Job, the book, is arguably the oldest book in the Old Testament. It apparently happened around the time of Abraham or so, but there's no mention in the book of Abraham, of Israel, of the temple, of Moses, and none of that is mentioned anywhere in the book. So it's a very, very ancient book. And if that is the fact, that it is truly one of the most ancient books in the Bible, and at the same time, it is all about God declaring his absolute sovereignty over absolutely everything, then really the Bible from first to last is a declaration of God's sovereignty in all things. That just seems unavoidable. So Job, going through all the trouble that he went through, starting in chapter 23, there are a couple places actually where Job declares, if God were here, I would ask him about this. I would demand answers from him, and he would have to answer me. He'd have to give an account for what I have endured here. Chapter 23, starting at verse 3, Job says, "Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come to his seat. I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn the words which he would answer and perceive what he would say to me." Well, that's very much like what the celebrity atheist said. If I could get to God and if he existed, I'd demand some answers from him. And that seems to be the attitude that Job is taking. And then Job gets his wish. God actually does show up and reply to him. But it's not the reply that Job expected. Instead, God, the absolute sovereign, unquestionable God, who does not take kindly to questions like, why are you doing this? It's like Paul arguing that the clay doesn't answer back to the potter and say, why have you made me like this? He's getting that from Job because God shows up and says to Job, starting in chapter 38, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkens my counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you will instruct me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line on it, or on what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God were shouting for joy? Well, that's just the beginning of God's argument. First, he points out that Job's words are words without knowledge, without understanding, that he doesn't comprehend the majesty of God, the determination or the plan of God, because we humans just simply can't. And I think the noted British atheist falls into that camp. He has words that have no knowledge, and yet in human hubris, the ego that is so common among people, he thinks that he's going to storm into God's presence and say, you're going to answer me. But God doesn't leave room for anybody questioning him. He goes on and talks about how he enclosed the sea, how he commands the morning, how he is the one in charge of the springs of the seas. He talks about the dwellings where light stays and where darkness has its place. He talks about the floods and the rains and the desolate lands and how he's the one that provides rain and frost from heaven. He goes on and says that he's the one who binds the chains of the Pleiades, and he looses the cords of Orion. Can you lead forth a constellation in its season? Well, obviously the answer to these questions is no, you can't do any of that. Do you know the ordinances of the heavens, or fix their rule over the earth? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds so that an abundance of water will cover you? Can you send forth lightnings that they may go and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the innermost being, or given understanding to the mind? Who can count the clouds by wisdom, or tip the water jars of the heavens when the dust hardens into a mass and the clods stick together? He goes on from there and says, are you the one that feeds lions? Do you take care of baby lions? Do you know the time that the mountain goats are going to give birth? Obviously, the answer to all of these things is no. We human beings don't do that. God does that. He talks about wild donkeys. He talks about the fact that he knows ostriches, how their wings flap joyously, and yet she abandons her eggs in the earth, and then she forgets them and her feet crush them. He even knows intimately the character of individual animals because he's in charge of them. He's the one who gave the horse his might. He's the one who gave understanding to the hawks when they soar in the sky. He's the one that gives the eagle the command so that he would mount up in his nest on high. So then in chapter 40, Yahweh finally says to Job, finally questioning Job, when he said, quit you like a man, get on your feet before me, I'll ask you, and you'll answer me, not the other way around. The Lord said to Job, will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God answer it. Answer my question. Tell me, if you, who are finding fault with me, do you really think that you're going to argue, you're going to contend with, you're going to stand against the Almighty One, the Sovereign One? No, you are not going to do that. And Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am insignificant. How can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. Once I have spoken, and I will not answer. Even twice, and I will add nothing more. And you would think at that point that God would sort of relent and say, okay, Job, you've learned your lesson. But no, instead, God continues and presses the point to make sure that there's no confusion about who he is and who human beings are. The Lord answered Job out of the storm and said, Now gird up your loins like a man. Once again, stand up before me. I will ask you, and you will instruct me. Will you really annul my judgment? Will you condemn me so that you can be justified? Or do you have an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? Adorn yourself with eminence and dignity, and clothe yourself with honor and majesty. Pour out the overflowings of your anger, and look on everyone who is proud, and bring him low. Look on everyone who is proud, and humble him, and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them in the dust together, bind them in the hidden place, and then, in other words, if you can do all that, if you can adorn yourself with the kind of glory that God has, if you're the one who can correct the proud, if you're the one who has an answer to the evil of this world, only if you have the kind of power and authority that God himself displays, then I will confess to you, says God, that your own right hand can save you. Clearly, God just said, because you can't do those things, you can't save you. You don't have the power. You don't have the authority. You don't have the jurisdiction. You cannot save you. Only Almighty God can do that. And so, just like the British atheist, and just like Job, and just like all of us humans, just like Paul talked about, we don't get to answer against our Maker. We don't get to argue with him. We don't get to ask, why have you made me like this? Because, as Paul said, who are you, O man, to answer back against God? That is a consistent testimony all the way through the Bible. You don't get to argue with God. You don't get to contend with him about how he gets things done, because his answer to you is always going to be, where were you when I did everything? When I continue to do everything? When I control the universe and the Pleiades and the stars and the influences of the planets, when I am the one that feeds wild animals and knows their nature and their character, when I'm the one who's in charge of rain and thunder and snow and light and dark, when I am the one who actually does deal with the wicked and the evil of this world, when I'm the one who can bring the humble low, when you cannot do those things, and by the way, we can't, but God's argument is, when you can't do it, you are proving that you can't save you. Only the right hand of God and his power can save you. And that is according to the arguably oldest book of the Bible, and it is a theme that you find all the way through the rest of the Bible. You'd think at some point people would just go, okay, I get it. But they argue, they contend, they theologize, they think that just because they write a post on social media, that somehow puts God into some sort of theological box. But the fact of the matter is, God is not impressed, and God is not a respecter of any person. He doesn't care who you are or how powerful you think you are in this world. He's the one who does absolutely everything, and therefore he's the one who is in charge of salvation and condemnation and eternity and eschatology and absolutely everything, because he is, what's that word I keep using? Sovereign. All right. Talk to you again. Bye.